David sat in his modest office, where the lamp's light cast long shadows on the walls. He worked as a detective in a small town in Oregon, and he enjoyed solving mysteries. Lately, however, work had been scarce, and David increasingly felt dissatisfied with the routine. One evening, just as he was about to go home, a young woman named Sarah entered the office. She looked bewildered and a bit frightened. David offered her a seat and listened to her story. Sarah explained that her younger brother Jacob had disappeared 3 days ago after going to a new amusement park out of town. She said the park had appeared suddenly and advertised itself as the scariest experience of your life. Jacob was fascinated by such things and couldn't miss the chance to visit the new attraction, the Mirror Maze. David decided to take on the case. He knew that such disappearances rarely had simple explanations, but something about this story seemed particularly eerie. The next day, he headed to the amusement park to start his investigation. The park was open and greeted visitors with its bright lights and loud music. David passed through the main entrance, where he was welcomed by a woman in a clown costume with a very wide smile. She couldn't answer his questions about Jacob, but advised him to contact the administration. David proceeded to the administration building, where he met the park's manager, a man named Henry. Henry assured him that nothing unusual had happened and showed him the surveillance footage. The recordings showed Jacob entering the Mirror Maze, but he never exited. The cameras inside the maze were not working, adding to the mystery. Realizing that the maze was the key to the mystery, David decided to go through it himself. He bought a ticket and entered the dark corridor, where mirrors reflected his confused face. The walls of the maze reflected light, creating an illusion of infinity. As he walked further, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The mirrors seemed to come alive, reflecting faces of non-existent people. David tried to keep his composure, but each step became increasingly difficult. It felt as though hundreds of eyes were watching him. At one of the junctions, he noticed a strange inscription on a mirror. "Souls remain here forever." He tried to understand the meaning of this message, but it only added to his fear. The path ahead grew darker, and the echo of his steps sounded like a sinister whisper. David remembered Jacob and decided not to give up. He continued forward, even though it felt like an endless nightmare. Suddenly, he heard a faint sobbing. He followed the sound and found a small room with one large mirror on the wall. In the mirror, he saw Jacob standing next to him, but not reflected in the real world. David tried to touch Jacob through the mirror, but his hand just passed through the glass. Jacob seemed to be trying to say something, but his words were drowned out by a creepy noise coming from somewhere behind the mirror. Suddenly, the mirror began to shake, and Jacob's face disappeared, leaving only emptiness. David felt panic taking over. He tried to find a way out of the maze, but all the corridors looked the same. It seemed like he was walking in circles. The mirrors started to reflect his own fears, turning them into terrifying images that haunted him at every step. Finally, he found a door that looked like an exit. He ran through it, feeling relieved, but ended up back at the beginning of the maze. The mirrors around him reflected his exhausted face and sinister figures slowly closing in on him. David felt despair engulfing him with every passing minute. The maze seemed to be playing with him, not allowing him to find an exit. His breathing became ragged, and his heart pounded so loudly it seemed to shatter the silence of the maze. The mirrors continued to reflect his fears, turning them into horrific visions. The sense of hopelessness intensified when he saw the inscription on one of the mirrors again. "Souls remain here forever." These words now seemed not just a warning, but a sentence. David knew he had to gather his strength and continue searching for the exit, but his energy was waning. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. David turned around and saw a strange figure approaching. It was a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit, with a face that seemed familiar. "Who are you?" David asked, feeling fear creeping in. "I am one of those who also sought an exit from this maze," the man replied. "My name is John, and I got stuck here many years ago." John shared his story. He, too, had come to the maze looking for a missing person, but became its prisoner himself. It turned out the maze had a life of its own, feeding on the fears and souls of those who entered it. John explained that the only way to find the exit was to overcome one's deepest fears. David felt this was his only chance. He mustered all his courage and began moving deeper into the maze, trying to ignore the eerie reflections and sounds around him. Each step required incredible effort, but he knew he couldn't stop. He remembered Sarah and her brother, and it gave him strength. David realized he had no right to give up, as not only his life, but Jacob's fate depended on it. He kept moving, despite the pain and fear. Finally, he saw a light ahead. It was like a glimmer of hope in the darkness. David ran toward it, his heart pounding faster. He entered a large room with a huge mirror on the wall. This mirror was different from the others. It reflected nothing but endless darkness. David approached and saw his reflection in the mirror. But suddenly his face began to change, turning into the faces of other people who had once been prisoners of the maze. He saw Jacob, Sarah, John, and many others who had fallen into this trap. The mirror began to shake, and David felt himself being pulled inside. He tried to resist, but his strength was failing. The darkness within the mirror grew closer until it engulfed him completely. In his final moments before the darkness consumed him entirely, David realized he had become part of the maze. His soul would now remain here forever, like the souls of others who had fallen into this trap. His fears, which he had tried to overcome, had now become his eternal companions. The maze once again remained quiet and empty, waiting for new victims who dared to enter. The mirrors reflected only darkness and emptiness, a reminder of those who stayed here forever. Sarah, not receiving any news from David, realized something had gone wrong. She decided to go to the amusement park herself, hoping to find her brother and help the detective. She did not know that the same nightmare awaited her, which had engulfed David and Jacob. As she approached the mirror maze, she didn't know what lay ahead but felt she had to walk this path. And when she entered the maze, the mirrors greeted her with their cold reflections, ready to take another soul into their endless darkness. Richard, Tom, Jennifer, and Melanie had been best friends since childhood. They decided to celebrate their university graduation with a trip to the Dream World Amusement Park, famous for its enormous hedge maze. The maze was a new attraction, and its opening was accompanied by numerous myths and legends. Rumor had it that this maze was enchanted, and those who disappeared into it never returned. After a long day of riding the rides, the friends decided to test their skills in the maze. They approached it with laughter and jokes, but as they reached the entrance, they felt a strange sense of unease. The entrance to the maze was adorned with massive gates carved with eerie faces that seemed to watch every step. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Melanie asked, gripping Richard's hand. "Don't be a child, it's just a maze. We'll be out in 5 minutes," Tom reassured her with a smile. They entered the maze, and the gates closed behind them with a dull thud. The maze immediately seemed larger and more confusing than they had anticipated. High hedges blocked their view, leaving only narrow paths that seemed endless. The friends walked forward, cracking jokes, but each step increased their sense of dread. After a while, they realized they were lost. Every path looked the same, and it felt like they were walking in circles. Suddenly, they heard a strange whisper coming from deep within the maze. The whisper was barely audible, but so eerie that it made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. "Did you hear that?" Jennifer asked, looking around. "Probably just the wind," Richard replied, though his voice was tense. They continued walking, trying to find a way out. But with each step, the whisper grew louder and the atmosphere more terrifying. They realized that the whisper was calling their names, repeating them over and over. "We need to find a way out of here," Tom said, trying to appear calm. but his eyes betrayed his fear. Suddenly, from around one of the corners, a figure in a dark cloak appeared. It moved slowly, almost gliding, as if not touching the ground. The figure's face was hidden by a hood, but an aura of cold death emanated from it. The figure stopped and pointed at the friends, speaking in a voice that was both a whisper and a thunderclap. "You have come to a place from which there is no return." The friends ran in different directions, trying to escape the eerie figure. Melanie and Richard ran together, trying not to get separated. They ran without stopping, but each turn looked the same, and the fear of the unknown became unbearable. "We need to find the others," Richard said, trying not to panic. "What is this place?" Melanie whispered, her voice trembling. They stumbled upon a small clearing in the center of the maze where an old, rusty well stood. The same whisper emanated from the well, but now it sounded sinister and almost threatening. Richard approached the edge of the well and peered inside. He saw only darkness that seemed bottomless. "We need to get out of here," he said, stepping back from the well. But as they tried to leave, the figure in the dark cloak appeared again, this time closer. It extended a hand toward Richard, and at that moment he felt his body paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stared into the void under the figure's hood. "You cannot escape," the figure said, and its voice echoed in Richard's head like a bell. Melanie screamed, trying to pull Richard away, but her efforts were in vain. The figure came closer and closer to Richard, and his world darkened, swallowing his mind into an abyss of fear. Richard vanished into the darkness, leaving Melanie alone with her terror. She cried, trembling with fear, not understanding what was happening. Her body was paralyzed with fright, and she had no idea where to go next. Time seemed to stand still, and she lost her sense of reality. Suddenly, Tom's scream echoed from the depths of the maze. Melanie gathered all her strength and ran toward the sound. She pushed through the thick hedges, feeling the branches scratch her skin, but she didn't stop. She had to find her friends. Finally, she found Tom, who was kneeling with his hands on his head. He looked crazed with fear, his eyes wide open, and his lips murmuring something unintelligible. Melanie ran to him and tried to calm him down. "Tom, it's me, Melanie. We need to find a way out of here." She held his shoulders, trying to bring him back to reality. But Tom didn't respond. He continued to murmur about the darkness and fear. Melanie was even more frightened, not knowing what to do. She looked around, trying to find any sign of where to go next. Suddenly, she saw Jennifer. She was standing a few meters away, motionless, as if enchanted. Her eyes were empty, and she looked like she had lost all will to fight. Melanie rushed to her, trying to wake her up. "Jennifer, we have to get out of here! Come on, wake up!" She shook her, but Jennifer didn't respond. Melanie felt panic engulf her from within. She didn't know how to help her friends, and felt that this maze had become a trap for their souls. She gathered all her strength and decided she had to find a way out herself, then come back for her friends. She ran forward without looking back. The whispers in the maze grew louder, turning into screams that haunted her. She ran, feeling her heart pounding in her chest, and every step felt like her last. Suddenly, she stumbled upon another clearing, where a huge mirror maze stood. The entrance was decorated with glittering LEDs that flickered in the darkness. Melanie felt this was her last chance to find a way out. She entered the mirror maze, trying to find the right path. But the mirrors reflected her fears, her doubts, her pain. She saw her reflections with distorted faces, whispering to her about hopelessness. She felt her mind slowly starting to give in. But she didn't stop. She knew she had to find the exit. Suddenly, she saw a light at the end of the corridor. It was a sign of the exit. She ran towards it, hoping it wasn't another trick. When she exited the mirror maze, she saw the figure in the dark cloak standing by the exit. The figure turned to her, and Melanie felt a cold terror envelop her. "You cannot escape," the figure said again, its voice echoing in Melanie's head like a bell. Melanie felt her body paralyzed with fear, but she didn't stop. She knew she had to fight. She took a step forward, trying to pass by the figure, but it grabbed her arm, and Melanie felt her consciousness begin to fade. "You will be part of this maze," the figure whispered, and its eyes glowed red. Melanie felt her mind engulfed by darkness, and the last thing she saw was the figure's face, smiling a sinister smile. Her body fell to the ground, and the figure disappeared into the shadows. The maze remained quiet and eerie. The friends never returned. The legend of the enchanted maze became even more terrifying, and the Dream World amusement park continued to attract new visitors, unaware of the horrors awaiting them within the green walls. No one knew that the souls of Richard, Tom, Jennifer, and Melanie were now forever trapped in the maze, doomed to wander in the darkness, haunted by their worst fears. Around midnight, in the old abandoned amusement park, the lights flickered. The November wind, sweeping through the pavilions and carousels, brought with it a sense that something unholy had awakened. Emma and her friends decided to embark on an adventure they had been planning for a long time, visiting the Carnival of Fear. Emma, a student at a local university, was always interested in the paranormal. She had read many stories about this park, which was rumored to be cursed. Her friends Jack, Michael, and Susan agreed to join her on this risky journey. They all thought it would be a fun adventure, despite the scary legends. As they approached the park, they saw the huge gates, adorned with once bright, now faded posters of clowns and various attractions. The gates were open, as if inviting them in. Inside, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the rustling of fallen leaves underfoot. "This place is really creepy," whispered Susan, looking around. "Look at this," exclaimed Jack, pointing to a huge carousel in the center of the park. The carousel looked abandoned, but still majestic. The horses, adorned with golden details, seemed terrifying in their stillness. Emma took out her smartphone and started filming for her blog. "Let's split up to cover more ground," suggested Michael. "Susan and I will go left, and you and Jack go right." Agreeing, they separated. Emma and Jack walked past old arcade machines when suddenly the lights around them began to dim. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. "Maybe this was a bad idea," said Emma, squeezing Jack's hand. "Don't worry, we'll find our way back," replied Jack, trying to reassure her. They reached an old hall of mirrors, which looked utterly uninviting. Suddenly, they heard loud laughter. It was the laughter of a clown, echoing from all directions. "Do you hear that?" asked Jack, looking around. "Yes," answered Emma, her voice trembling with fear. They entered the hall, where everything was covered in dust. The mirrors, which once reflected the joyful faces of visitors, now seemed like portals to another world. Suddenly, the lights in the hall turned on, and the mirrors began showing strange scenes, abandoned attractions, dead clowns, and the horrified faces of Emma and Jack. The clowns in the reflections came to life and started chasing them through the maze of mirrors. "Let's get out of here!" screamed Emma, grabbing Jack's hand. They ran toward the exit, but each mirror reflected a different path, confusing them even more. The laughter grew louder and louder. Meanwhile, Michael and Susan stumbled upon an old freestyle trampoline. Suddenly, the attraction came to life and started moving on its own. Susan jumped back in fear as she saw a mechanical hand rising from the ground, trying to grab her. "Michael, we need to find the others and leave this place immediately," she yelled. Michael, looking around, saw figures of clowns and actors emerging from other attractions, becoming aggressive. They looked alive, but their faces were horribly distorted. "Where could they be?" asked Michael, trying to stay calm. "Maybe they're by the Hall of Mirrors. Let's go there," answered Susan. As they approached the hall, they heard the same loud laughter again. Susan and Michael ran to the entrance, and saw Emma and Jack trying to find their way out of the mirror maze. "Emma! Jack!" shouted Susan, trying to get their attention. Emma turned and saw her friends. They quickly ran to them, and all together they exited the hall. "We need to find a way out of the park," said Jack, looking around. "Something is very wrong here." As they approached the exit, the gates creaked loudly and closed. The lights went out, leaving them in complete darkness. The clown's laughter echoed again, this time very close. "We're trapped," whispered Emma, feeling fear fill her heart. Emma felt her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness surrounding them was so thick that she couldn't even see her own hand in front of her face. The clown's laughter echoed closer and closer, filling them with terror. "We need to find another way out," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly. "Maybe there are other gates or exits." "Yes, but where do we go?" Susan asked, her voice barely audible from fear. "Let's try to get back to the central square," Michael suggested. "There might be a map of the park, or at least some direction." The group, staying close together, cautiously moved back towards the center of the park, relying on memory and trying to avoid any dark corners. They could barely see the path ahead, but they moved quickly, knowing that standing still meant certain doom. They emerged onto the central square where the huge carousel was located. Around it now stood figures of clowns and other actors, seemingly waiting for them. They looked real, but their eyes glowed with a sinister red light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, squeezing Jack's hand. "Stay quiet," Jack said, trying to calm her. "We need to find the park map." They cautiously circled the carousel, trying not to attract the figure's attention. Suddenly, Susan noticed an old map of the park on the wall. "Here it is!" she exclaimed, pointing at the map. "There's another exit near the haunted house." "All right, let's move there," Michael said, "but be careful." They began to move towards the haunted house, trying to stay together and not fall behind. The darkness around them seemed even thicker, and the clown's laughter continued, making their hearts race faster. "This place is truly cursed," Jack said, trying not to lose confidence. "I know," Emma replied, her voice filled with fear. "But we must get out of here alive." As they approached the haunted house, the doors were ajar. Inside it was dark and cold, as if the air itself was filled with fear. "Let's go inside," Michael said. "Maybe there's a way through to the other exit." They entered the haunted house and the doors slammed shut behind them with a loud bang. Susan screamed in fear, but Jack took her hand, trying to calm her. "It's going to be okay," he said. "Just stick together." Inside the house, it was dark, and they could barely see anything in front of them. Suddenly, figures began to emerge from the darkness, moving towards them. These were the same clowns and actors, but now they looked even scarier, their faces twisted with horror. "Run!" Emma screamed, and they rushed forward, trying to avoid the pursuing figures. They ran through various rooms of the haunted house, each filled with even more terrifying images. Skeletons, ghosts, sinister dolls. Everything seemed to come to life as they passed by. Finally, they reached a room where, according to Susan, the exit was supposed to be. But instead of an exit, they saw a huge mirror covering the entire wall. "This can't be true," Michael said, looking around. "Where's the exit?" "Maybe it's an illusion," Emma said. "We need to find a way through this mirror." They approached the mirror, trying to find any clues. Suddenly, hands emerged from the mirror, grabbing them and pulling them inside. They screamed in terror, trying to break free, but the hands were too strong. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves in a strange world where everything was distorted and terrifying. They stood in a square that looked like a parody of the park's central square. Around them were the same clowns and actors, but now they looked even more horrifying. "Where are we?" Susan asked, her voice trembling with fear. "This is another world," Emma replied. "We're trapped." Suddenly, the main clown appeared, looking like a real demon. His face was twisted in a sinister grin, and his eyes glowed red. "Welcome to the Carnival of Fear," he said, his voice sounding ominous. "You will never escape." Emma felt her heart stop. They were trapped, with no way out. The clowns and actors began to close in on them, and she realized this was the end. "We have to fight," Jack said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't just give up." But they were powerless against these horrifying creatures. The clowns and actors grabbed them and started dragging them towards the central carousel, which now looked like a real instrument of torture. "This can't be real," Emma whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "We can't die here." But this was the end. They were trapped in the carnival of fear, and now their souls belonged to this sinister place forever. The lights went out, and the last thing they heard was the main clown's sinister laughter echoing across the square. The amusement park Moon Circle had always been a place of joy and fun. The town of Darkwood prided itself on its park, which had been in operation for over 100 years. An old train, which once carried children and adults, became one of the main attractions. However, after the mysterious disappearance of the train engineer, Henry Lawrence, the train was closed. People said that his spirit never left the park. Kate and Michael, two college friends, decided to spend the weekend in Darkwood. They had heard legends about the ghost train and wanted to see if it was true. At night, they sneaked into the park through old gates that had long been unused. The moonlight illuminated the rusty rides, creating eerie shadows. "It's really creepy here," said Michael, looking around at the dark corners of the park. "That's why we're here," Kate smiled, but there was a noticeable tension in her eyes. "The train is supposed to appear at midnight, so the legends say." They approached the old tracks that stretched into the darkness. The wind gently swayed the trees, creating the impression that the park was alive. The time was approaching midnight, and Michael decided to lighten the mood by telling silly jokes. But Kate did not laugh. She was focused on the darkness that covered the park. Suddenly, they heard a faint thumping sound, like the noise of train wheels. Kate shuddered. She looked at Michael and his face changed. He heard it too. "This is a joke, right?" Kate asked nervously. Michael just shook his head. They listened, and the thumping became louder. Fog began to creep along the tracks, and out of the darkness, two lights appeared. The headlights of an old train. The train was approaching, moving silently, as if through the air. Their hearts beat in unison with the sound of the wheels. Kate felt panic overwhelming her. The train stopped in front of them, and the doors of the carriages opened with a creak. "Do you see this?" she whispered. "Yes, I see it," Michael replied, not taking his eyes off the train. The friends moved closer, trying to understand what was happening. They couldn't believe their eyes. Inside the carriages there was no one, but the seats and walls were covered in dust, as if the train had been standing there for hundreds of years. "We have to go inside," Kate decided. She didn't wait for an answer and stepped onto the carriage's step. "Kate, wait!" Michael grabbed her hand, but she was already inside. The carriage was cold, and it seemed that time had stopped there. Old posters on the walls told of happy times when the train was the main attraction. Michael reluctantly followed her. They moved forward, carefully examining every corner. Suddenly, the doors behind them closed with a loud bang. Kate and Michael stopped, looking at each other in horror. They tried to open the doors, but they wouldn't budge. "We're stuck," Kate panicked. "What do we do?" Michael began searching for another way out. They walked through the carriage, but all the doors were locked. With each step, they felt the cold seeping into their bones. Kate remembered the legend. Every full moon, the train appears on the tracks and takes passengers to the afterlife. "This is the ghost train," she whispered. "We have to get out of here." Suddenly, they heard footsteps. Someone was walking down the carriage towards them. The friends stopped, not knowing what to do. Out of the shadows emerged a figure in an old engineer's uniform. "Welcome, passengers," the man said, his voice cold and detached. "It's time to depart." Kate and Michael stood frozen in place, not believing their eyes. The figure in the old engineer's uniform was approaching, his face partially hidden in shadow, but his eyes glowed with an eerie light. Each step of the ghostly engineer sounded like hammer blows to their nerves. "Who are you?" Kate asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I am Henry Lawrence, the engineer of this train," the man replied coldly, as if it were obvious. "And today, you will become our honored passengers." Kate and Michael felt their hearts tighten with fear. They tried to retreat, but the train car doors slammed shut with a loud bang. The engineer slowly approached, his figure becoming more realistic, yet simultaneously surreal. "This is impossible," Kate whispered, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. You can't be real." "I have been here longer than you can imagine," Henry replied, his voice filled with sorrow and anger. "And now it's time for your journey." At that moment, the train began to move. The car windows fogged up, and the moonlight disappeared. Kate and Michael realized they were no longer in the park. They had embarked on an unknown journey. "We have to find a way out," Kate decided, grabbing Michael's hand. They ran through the car, trying to find any crack through which they could escape. But the train seemed endless, and each subsequent car looked the same as the previous one. Henry followed them, unhurried but never falling behind. His presence induced fear and despair. They ran faster, trying to get away from him, but the train seemed to have a life of its own, not allowing them to break free. "Michael, this way!" Kate saw a door leading to another car. They ran inside and shut the door behind them, trying to breathe more calmly. "We can't stay here," Michael whispered. "He'll find us." They continued their run, but with each step, they felt their strength leaving them. The car was filled with old things, ancient suitcases, broken toys, dust that reminded them of past times. Kate stopped, examining an old photograph on the wall. It was Henry Lawrence, smiling and happy, next to his train. "That's him," she whispered. "But how is it possible? He looks completely different." "Time has left its mark on him," came a sudden voice from behind. Kate turned around and saw Henry standing very close. "You don't understand," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "I didn't want this. I was just doing my job, but one day the train took me just as it is now taking you." Kate and Michael realized they were dealing with something much bigger and scarier than they could have imagined. Henry was a prisoner of this train, just as they were now. "What can we do?" Michael asked, feeling hopeless. "The only way to break free is to find the heart of the train," Henry replied. "An ancient amulet hidden in one of the cars. It holds us all captive." Kate and Michael decided to search for the amulet, despite their fear and exhaustion. They made their way through the cars, feeling the weight of time and despair pressing down on them. Each car was filled with ghosts of the past, reaching out with cold hands, trying to drag them into the darkness. Finally, in one of the cars, they found an old chest covered in dust and cobwebs. Opening it, they saw an ancient amulet that emitted a faint light. It was the heart of the train. "We found it," Kate said, feeling hope begin to return. But Henry appeared again. This time his face was filled with pain and determination. "You must destroy it," he said. "Only then can we all be free." Kate and Michael couldn't believe their ears, but they knew it was the only way. They lifted the amulet and smashed it on the ground. Light spread throughout the car, and the train began to shake and fall apart. The ghosts that were imprisoned inside started to disappear, their faces becoming peaceful and grateful. Henry smiled one last time before his body dissolved into the light. Kate and Michael felt their bodies become lighter, and they returned to reality. They found themselves on the tracks, but the train was gone. They were free. The friends looked at the ruins of the old park, realizing they had experienced something incredible. They hugged, feeling joy and relief. "We did it," Michael said. "We're free." Kate smiled, looking at the moon that illuminated their path back home. They knew they would never forget this night and the spirits they helped free. The Moon Circle Amusement Park was once again a quiet and peaceful place. But the legend of the ghost train would remain in Darkwood's memory forever.